poetry attracts attention and interest of 21st century literature circles of London. Furthermore, I'm pleased to mention that UNESCO also celebrates this anniversary with a number of events in different important venues all over the globe. During his short life, Nikoloz Baratashvili developed complex concepts of art and ideas. Even though Baratashvili was part of Georgian elite, his works were unknown to the broad public. Unpublished at the time of his death, his poetry did not receive deserved recognition until later in the 19th century, when another poet and statesman, rediscovered his works. His traumatic personal life, as well as contemporary political situation in Georgia, are the main reasons of the tragic nature of Tato's poetry that is filled with romantic spirit and revolutionary aspirations, coupled with deep patriotic outlooks. In his historic poem, Fate of Georgia, written at the age of 22, he reproduces a debate that took place between Georgian King Erekle II and his Chancellor Solomon Leonidze, who opposed the union with Russia, believing it would result in the loss of Georgia's national identity. In addition, Baratashvili is often referred as Georgian Byron in literature circles. Some critics argue about Byron's influence on Baratashvili's work. Works like famous Merani is believed to be influenced by Byron's Mazepa. Georgian professor and researcher Ines Merabishvili elaborates more on these resemblances, but I'm sure this question also will be exploited in the talk of dear Professor Benfield. Tato Baratashvili continues to be very popular in modern Georgia. I'm pleased to offer concrete evidence of that. There is a project, World Poetry Book, which combines the most loved and popular poetries from all over the world, and this book will be published very soon in the United Kingdom. And based on this project, individual countries collected best, the authors collected from individual countries best 3 poetries. And Georgia's choice includes Nikoloz Baratashvili's Merani for this collection. So it gives us, again, very good understanding that today Tato is popular in modern Georgia. So finally, I would like to once again say a big thank you to Asia House for organizing this event and for active cooperation with Georgian Embassy on this and other projects. And we highly value this partnership and very much keen to further expand the scopes of our cooperation for other events. So at the end, I want to wish all of us pleasant evening in a company of Tato Baratashvili's poetry, and of course Georgian wine, which always brings special flavor to any Georgian event. Thank you very much.
Well, Baratashvili, born 1817 and died very early, 1845, is certainly known as a Georgian Byron. So let's go through what's Byronic about him. One is his aristocratic origin, in which case he beats Byron, because he is a direct descendant of King Erekle II, perhaps Georgia's most distinguished king. And in fact, his great-grandmother is the mother of another king, King Solomon II of Imeretius, so 2 kings in the family line. And it's not unusual in Georgia, because King Erekle had 23 children, and his son Georgi had 13, so I imagine there are several hundred people that could claim that. But he was linked with all the main aristocratic families in Georgia, Orbelianis and so on, so certainly an aristocrat. More ironic, perhaps, is that early on as a schoolboy he fell downstairs and broke a leg. So he was lame for the rest of his life. His father used to sneer and say, "Koche, you're a cripple, you're lame," which meant, of course, that he couldn't join the army, which was clearly his dream. So we may be grateful for his falling downstairs. He was lame for life, and although he said to his father, "I can still dance and jump about in my own way," his father wouldn't have him even applying for the army. Well, as for his handsomeness, Byronic handsome, we don't have any portrait from the life. We only have portraits done by after description of his contemporaries. So the picture you can see there may be a little bit prettified. Like Byron, he's well known for his love affairs, but his love affairs are very different from Byron's. None of them, as far as we can see, was consummated. They're all unhappy. He began with a love affair with a French woman called, whom we know very little, Delphine Labielle. And if you look at the consular records for the French consulate in Tiflis in the 1830s, 1840s, you find there are a lot of stray French women in Tbilisi. Usually they're the widows of experts who come to Georgia to advise on roads and so on, and who had then died. And usually these people were found jobs as schoolmistresses teaching French. Delphine Labielle was probably much older than him, because the only thing we know about her afterwards is that in the 1850s she announced that she'd married all her daughters off to Russian officers. So that didn't work. Then the lifelong unrequited passion which motivates his poetry is for the second daughter of his closest friend and host, Alexandre Chavchavadze, who's a major poet, a major romantic poet. I might say that in Georgia the situation is unique. The main romantic poets, three Orbelianis and Chavchavadze, are all high-ranking cavalry officers in the Russian army, which is unusual. We'll talk about Ekaterina Chavchavadze later. She became the wife of the Dadiani, the ruler of Mingrelia. And if that passion had resulted in marriage, God help him. She became the mistress of Mingrelia in 1839, and she had such a reputation for tyranny, calling on government troops to shoot at her peasants when they rebelled, that the Russian government decided to incorporate Mingrelia into the state. They didn't dare talk to her. They asked her sister to come and negotiate. The Governor General refused. His last love, apparently, or last interest, was when he was already in Azerbaijan, in Nakhichevan, that little enclave now between Armenia and Turkey. And this seems very unwise. He was much taken by the unhappily married 18-year-old daughter of the Khan of Nakhichevan. Her name was Kunchibeyim, and she was a poet, most of whose work has been lost. In fact, there's a few lines that survive. Two are translated by Baratashvili, and they run, "My beautiful garden, I want to come and see you, to chat with your fountain, your flowers, but I am afraid that my husband might be there." Baratashvili translated that from Azeri. His view of love, judging by his letters, was very idealistic. He quotes Rustavelli, "If the beloved becomes cheap, then she's not worth a straw." That's not a good recipe. Well, he's Byronic too, in that he did write political verse. He only wrote one, a long poem, The Fate of Georgia, as well as his lyrics. But his political poetry is very different from Byron's. It's loyal to the existing order. In fact, you might say he ought to have known the real facts, but he falsifies them to make Russia seem the protective power over Georgia. And there's very little satire in his work, apart from his letters. And like Byron, he apparently could get involved in a fight. He was given by his uncle, who was a cavalry officer, a magnificent rifle, and he wrote back and said, "Can I have a pair of pistols?" You only have pairs of pistols if you're going to take up dueling, because then you can offer your opponent a choice of a pistol, and your opponent will know that you'll be equally matched. He did, in fact, get involved in a duel, and it was a duel set up by a notorious man called Martynov, the man who shot the Russian poet Lermontov. Lermontov said at the duel, "I'm not going to fire at that fool," so Martynov killed him. And Martynov liked provoking duels, but Baratashvili got out of it by his friend and boss, and was spared for a few more years. So finally, like Byron, he died of a fever in what is reputed to be a remote hellhole. Well, I've never been to Ganja, so I can't say. But I do note that the last letter he wrote was written from the governor's country lodge at Murud, which is outside Ganja, and presumably was not quite so hellish. Well, Byron has often been a model for Georgian poets, and I think the Georgians have had just one Byron, Besiki, the 18th century poet who annoyed the Catholicos of Georgia so much he had to leave the country, and then probably had an affair with the wife of the king of Imereti, who then appointed him as a diplomat, which is, I think, one way of appointing diplomats. Byron stopped being a model for Georgian poets at a legendary meeting of the Union of Writers in the 1930s, when a proletarian poet who was secretary of the union said, "We've all got to write like Byron." And one poet in the hall said, Byron was an aristocrat, wasn't he? Yes, he was an aristocrat. Byron was rich, wasn't he? Yes, Byron was rich. Byron was handsome, wasn't he? Yes, he was handsome. And there you are, you're a peasant, you're poor and you're ugly, and you want to write like Byron. And since then, Byron has not been a model. Well, the main tragedy for Baratashvili was that he was known to so few of his contemporaries. Partly the problem that Georgian printing presses were hardly ever used for printing literature in the 1830s and 1840s. They were used for government proclamations, for church material, and the only Georgian books that he would have had printed in his lifetime were the Praises of Queen Tamar by Chakrukhadze, very difficult, complicated poetry of the 13th century, and the new edition of the Psalms, which you can see from his poetry had a great influence. Poems survived because they were in letters, or you wrote them in albums at the salons of young ladies, or they were circulated. And so the memoirs of his contemporaries don't begin until 20 years after his death. Oddly enough, actually, a number of Polish poets who were exiled to Tbilisi took notice of him. One or two even started learning Georgian, and they do mention him in the letters, and they wrote articles about him, but not in Russia. His poetry gives no biographical details. You get some idea from the 15 letters that have survived. He was forced to enter, because his father had squandered the family inheritance, the civil service, which was corrupt, as he said, boring and exhausting. In Russia, if a civil servant started taking bribes or behaving badly, you sent him to the Caucasus, where he had 100% pension and total impunity. So to join that administration was, for a time, until the 1850s, when things improved, very difficult. And then in 1844, he had to get a civil service job as a deputy governor, which is really a police official in charge of chasing up bandits in Nakhichevan and then Ganja. And he complains of loneliness. And the complaint he quotes Leontov's famous poem, "Istushny, grusny, nekomu ruku pожать," I'm bored and I'm sad and there's nobody's hand I want to shake. Now his main concern, judging by his letter, is marrying off his sisters, of which he had 4. We have his military interests, but what is most striking, he has absolutely no sympathy with Georgian irredentists or nationalists. His teacher, Solomon Dodashvili, was arrested for inspiring the young Georgians who rebelled in 1832, the sort of Georgian Decembrists who decided they'd invite the entire Russian administration to a ball and then arrest the lot and then take over the country and restore it to the 1783. Solomon Dodashvili died of TB in the Urals. He'd been a Decembrist. He even gave the young men advice, go this time, don't make the mistake the Decembrists made, go and seize the arsenal so you have plenty of guns. They were treated extremely leniently, partly because Nikoloz I got a very bad reputation for what he did crushing the Polish rebellion in 1830, hanging and exiling, which is why there are so many Poles in Georgia. But Baratashvili, although he is 2 or 3 years younger than those who'd suffered, has absolutely no sympathy with the rebel crown princes. Now, Poland and Georgia have very similar fates, or they consider they do, both independent kingdoms swallowed up by Catherine the Great. And ever since, right until today, one notices that sympathy. Interconnections of exile. And one of the important figures for Baratashvili is the Polish romantic poet Adam Mickiewicz, who was exiled to Russia for a time. Mickiewicz never got as far as Georgia, he got no nearer than Odessa or Crimea, but the Polish emigre poets who were in Tbilisi, they visited the Chavchavadze household and had a great influence. The other odd thing about Baratashvili, he mentions things where the Russians were particularly cruel to the Georgians, the Gurian rebellion in 1840 and the rebellions in eastern Kakheta. He, in his letter, approves of their crushing. His only criticism of society around him is of Georgians. He accuses them in Russian of being bespechness, being not caring about anything, innate weakness in general, and complained that Georgians don't prepare heirs to take over the estates. One of the reasons his father gave for not letting him go to university was, supposing I died while you were in university, who would be continuing the family name? So, his political views, I'll begin with first, before we get to his lyrical poetry, come out in this, Fate of Georgia. We'll come to that shortly. Now, what did he read? He read Russian, certainly Russian was very good, and in Tbilisi there were complete sets of a volume called Library for Reading, 43 volumes of Russian poetry, so he knew that well. And through Russian he knew some Shakespeare, a little bit of Goethe, Lamartine and so on, even though there was no theatre to see plays in Tbilisi. The circle he mixed in was the circle of the man he wished to have as his father-in-law, Alexander Chavchavadze, in Tiflis and in the palace at Simendali in Kakheta. And that was a place where there were a lot of foreign visitors, even the odd Englishman turned up from time to time. Family poets, 3 fine daughters, of which the most distinguished was Nino, who was the widow of the Russian diplomat and playwright Gribeyev. Now, Gribeyev is a sort of, if it was the Daily Mail today, Gribeyev was everyone's nightmare. He was the young student you hired to teach your 12-year-old daughter music, drawing, and French, and then at the age of 15 she declares she wants to marry him. And she was widowed at 16 when he was murdered in the Tehran embassy, and she wore black, which we're going to come to later, what's in colour, and she declared she'd never marry ever again, and she became the most famous widow in Georgia. Well, we're going to deal with that. Chavchavadze himself, as I said, is a founder of modern Georgian poetry. He's of considerable political importance. He began as a rebel and then became, like many of the other rebels, a loyal hussar in the Russian army, repressing Georgian peasants. He was a very original poet, and not only doing standard romantic poems about lakes and so on, but he wrote a poem called The Ploughman about the loss of potency, which I don't think many male poets ever write about. Now, the sources of, as Tamara said, that Baratashvili is extremely original. But he does know his Rustaveli, he knows his Sayat Nova. Sayat Nova was a sort of Armenian poet who wrote in Armenian, Azeri, Georgian, and even in Russian at one point, and who was reputably slaughtered at the door of a church by a Persian soldier in 1795. And he has wonderful love poetries, Oh My Poor Self, they usually begin. Baratashvili would also have known some Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, in Georgian translation, and as I said, he knew the Bible, he knew his Psalms. It makes his language extraordinary because he's a mixture of archaic vocabulary. A lot of Baratashvili requires, even for Georgians, a little dictionary at the end, because he's so soaked in medieval. He even makes up words because manuscripts could be misread. There's a famous word, which he interprets as meaning hair falling as a shadow on the chest. It's never occurred anywhere else. It's a misreading of the of Chakrukhadze, which means flickering of light. Well, let's begin then with his what he prized most, his Fate of Georgia, which he worked on for 5 years, starting at 22 and working on until his death. Now, he should have known the historical basis. The historical basis is the terrible defeat of Georgia by a Persian warlord who later became Shah Agha Muhammad Khan, 1795. I'll read you a few sentences on the note that Muhammad Khan sent to the king directly before he invaded, warning him. Last year you forced me to destroy a number of Georgians, although we had no desire at all for our subjects to perish by our own hand. Now, it is our great will that you, an intelligent man, break off relations with the Russians. If you do not carry out this order, then we shall shortly carry out a campaign against Georgia. We will shed both Georgian and Russian blood, and out of it will create rivers as big as the Koran. Well, lots of Georgian blood was shed. Tbilisi was turned into a heap of rubble. The Russians are sat by on the other side of the Caucasus, even receiving presents from Aga Mohammed Khan. And it's probably similar to Stalin's treatment of Warsaw, that you wait for the Germans to totally wreck it before you then take the country over. However, the part one is this last battle of Tabakh Mela, just outside Tbilisi, same place where the Red Army fought the Georgian army in February 21, and then the retreat to the fortress of Narikali in Tbilisi, and the rout by the Persians, after which Erekli retreats. Terrible, terrible defeat, and when you think Erekli II had been so powerful, everyone thought he might be the next Shah of Persia. He'd been chief commander of the Iranian army. Part two is a discussion between Erekli and his vice-chancellor Solomon Leonidze on whether handing the country to Russia was a good idea. Now, in fact, Leonidze was one of the ones that had actually proposed this in 1783. He wrote half the treaty. Unfortunately, a cunning Potemkin wrote the other half of the treaty. But there are some points in that treaty which were very desirable, that Russia would regain for Georgia all its medieval territory. But what Leonidze didn't anticipate, that Georgia would be forbidden to have relations with any other foreign country, which was the reason for the ease with which it was defeated. Well, I'll just give you a brief extract in prose. I wouldn't attempt to translate this to verse. The king says to Solomon, "You know our situation. Now we hear battle cries from Dagestan. The Ottomans are biding their time. Enemies will then strike us. Our young men will then slaughter one another. I am no longer your Erekli. What son do I see worthy of healing a shattered land?" The son, who was Georgia the 12th, was notorious for spending half the day praying, and the other half of the day, his son-in-law said, eating until he vomited. And he didn't like business estate. And when the Russians finally came, all he wanted was to make sure they had pensions. So Erekli is quite right there. "Now the fame of Russia is great," says the king. "It has a wise and bold monarch. We have been allies for a long time, with a strong union, common faith. I want to give them our heritage, and for them to give Georgia prosperity." I'm quite sure Erekli never said anything of the sort. If you go to the tomb of Georgia the 12th, there was, I think until recently, a plaque on it saying he died saying he entrusted his country to Russia. According to the people who were at Georgia's deathbed, he died saying, "My son David must be crowned king." So this is a Russian falsification. Leonidze, when he saw what the Russians were doing, completely changed his mind about the treaty. In fact, he shouted out from the church when the Russians were reading their manifest that you were now a province of Russia. He interpreted wrongly. He said, "They are announcing that King David has been crowned," and he had to be ejected. He then moved to Imerisha and tried to defend it there. Solomon Leonidze now replies, "Don't let Georgians who place their hopes in you hear such things. Why should we have to sell our freedom for this? How do you know, king, that the Georgians will be happy in Russian hands? A common faith is no use when customs are so different. Who knows what Russian power might do to today's Kartli, how the Russians will receive the Georgians, what peace Russian sovereignty may give us, what Georgians might wish for." Well, the king responds and he wins. Now is the time for Georgia to see peace, and only then will we be sure that the voices of Christians will always be heard and that they will rest in the shades of their forebears' grave. So it's a very powerful poem. It's like a rather Shakespearean, like one of Shakespeare's history plays. It's certainly biased towards the existing monarchy, but it's done, the rhetoric is extremely strong. But for a descendant of Erekli and of Erekli's best general, Nikoloz, who was known as the wolf of the earth for his ferocity, and for a worshipper of Alexander Chakchavadze, who was a rebel at first, it's a remarkable piece of surrender. Right, let's get down to the lyrics, which are much more famous. I thought we'd begin with perhaps the most extraordinary one, the most famous one, because Pasternak translated it so beautifully, because it's been set to music both in Georgian and to an Imeretian folk tune, and in Russian to music by Nikitin. If you go look it up on YouTube, you can find various recitals of it. To the color blue, I'll just give you the first verse in Georgian. Sisa pers, Murza pers, Pirvla pulisa pers, da amquekniers sic midigam veter podi. The color blue, color of azure, the first created color. This is the otherworldly hue that I have loved since early youth. And so on, and so on. Well, that seems a poem really ahead of its time. You think, well, this is the French symbolist, isn't it? Mallarmé with l'azur, 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 azure colour, the colour of symbolism. And then Georgian poets in the 20th century called them the blue horns, because they were associated with this blue, and then a bit of drinking, drinking horns as well, to go with it, a Dionysian element. What is extraordinary about it, however, is that his father-in-law, Chavchavadze, produced a very similar poem called Colour Black. Persas dnes, persas shavs, ne vertepi marad jams. Arodes persas hvas, arvetapo vputsavtsas. The dark colour, the black colour, I have always loved at all times. Never will I ever fall in love with another colour, I swear to heaven. What do you think? Well, colour black you would expect, because they were in this house where the most notable thing was Nino dressed in black. She'd been dressed in black for 8 years, and she was going to go on being dressed in black for the next 20. So that was clear. There are other poets who celebrated the fact that she was known as the Black Widow in the nicest sense of the word. Poems to Weeping Nina. But that isn't all, because Chavchavadze's poem is in fact a translation of a Russian poem. A minor Russian poet called nobody knows whether it's Dmitrievsky or Dmitrievsky, it doesn't matter, came to Tiflis and he wrote a poem called Black Colour. I think I've got somewhere. Chorny Sviat. Yes. Черный свет, брачный свет, ты мне мил навсегда. Я клянусь, не влюблюсь, другой свет никогда. Black color, dark color, I've loved you always. I swear I will never fall in love with any other color ever. So Chavchavadze is a translation of the Russian, and what has happened is that Baratashvili, his poem in some ways very different, but it's still a different color. And think of blue, why blue? And then the critics say, oh, Ekaterina had blue eyes. Look at a portrait, she didn't have blue eyes at all. The only blue in that household was the wife of Alexander Chavchavadze, who was being painted in blue. But I think it's because he loved the sky and he used this poem as a basis. Well, I don't want to belittle the poem, but it does have a Russian source and a potential father-in-law source, and he's adapted. He's not quite without precedent, as you might think. Now, the other poem I would like to look at, the next one, is one which is truly original. He's listening to his beloved, who never took any notice of him, Ekaterina, singing as she plays the piano. And this, I don't think it's ever been, anything like this has ever been written in Georgian before. Not even sure it's been written in Russian before. These musical, it does sound like someone playing the piano, or singing as a piano. Chma sakratista, nel nanarista, susgana chareps, dam shvenieris, ena amishlis, gulis chereps. The sound of the instrument, slow and soft, gives joy to the soul, and the language of beauty completely cancels the travails of the heart. Well, that is something that you'd only find in Russian in poetry of Afanasy Fiat. You find in Verlaine this attempt to make language imitate music in its rhythms, particularly difficult in Georgian with its consonantal elements. So that is a genuine new achievement, and I can't think of any Georgian poet until Galaction came along, Galaction Tabidze in the beginning of the 20th century, who continued in that line. Baratashvili had enormous influence. Nevertheless, that is a unique poem in his work. What is perhaps more important is the influence of psalms. Influence of psalms, which he mixes with romantic disillusion. There's a poem about finding an imaginary temple in the desert. The first one, I think, is, my God, this is Shelley, or is it Mandalis? Poved adzare shesapare, udavnot mangare, muni entomarad, okrobili smida lampare, angelos tagan ekroda mun davitis canare, la ganis moda tsior dasta galobis zari. I found shelter at a temple that stood in the desert, lit by an icon lamp that would never fade. I heard heaven's seraphim sing a descant to David's harp that the angels played. I must say, these poems are work in progress as far as translation is concerned. I wouldn't put them forward now. Now, you compare that with Shelley's I met a traveller from antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, and then nothing besides remain, and here too the whole thing vanishes. You just have desolation. Now, I think we should look closely at perhaps the poem that no Georgian child is allowed to escape at school, which is known as Merani, which is a word that means charger, steed, noble horse. The little problem is Baratashvili never called it Merani. In all his manuscripts it has no title, and in one of his manuscripts it's called The Abandoned Rider. It is one of his most remarkable ones because it's one of these horse poems which you meet in various languages. We'll come to shortly where he gets it from. And the horse image is particularly powerful in Russian literature, as you know, a horse running out of control without its rider. This is one of his longer lyrical poems and one of his most organized with refrains and so on. Mirbis, mimaprens, ugzo ukloch hemi merani, ukan momchavis, tvalbetit shavik orani, gasti merano, shens chelibas arak sabsvari, danias miets pikrichemi, shavad helvari. Now that it has a sort of horse galloping rhythm. My steed runs off and flees. So you've got the horse. My steed runs off and flees. Its hooves will leave no traces. And then you have the black raven cawing. Well, you might think this poem, Desolation, rider without his horse. We meet this again in a generation later in French symbolism. Geoffroy de Nerval, the Prince of Aquitaine, by the demolished tower, his star dead. This is one poem that Pasternak did not translate. You might think fortunate, actually. It's translated by the Acmeist poet Lozinski. The trouble with Pasternak's translations, if you ever attended Pasternak's Hamlet, I think this is not Hamlet as I know it. Pasternak is one of the freest translators ever. I think someone scored him once as that 1/3 accurate. Magnificent poems. He didn't know any Georgian. He was given cribs by Georgian poets, and he would then just evolve it as he liked. And nobody complained because the poem came out so magnificent that you didn't bother if it had very little to do with the original. Well, this was not translated by Pasternak, it's been translated by Lozinski, but it's had an enormous influence in Poland. And because it reflects a very similar poem by Mickiewicz called Faris, which is the Bedouin word for rider, horse rider. And this poem has the same ingredients: horse galloping on, rider abandoned, and a bird of prey looking on, thinking, well, it's a raven or a crow in Borani in Baratashvili, and in Mickiewicz it's a vulture. Now, by some extraordinary coincidence, that poem was translated into Georgian in 1832 by a man called Solomon Razmadze, who is not known as a great poet, but was a sort of a great sort of introducer of foreign poetry to Georgia. And it begins, my black steed like a storm cloud, etc., etc. And the vulture has heard and has decided to grab the Bedouin in this desert, and the rider's a fool, the horse is a fool, riding in the sands looking for a path. It's not an optimistic poem, Mickiewicz's poem, whereas Baratashvili's is, because Baratashvili says that horse is going to, I'm abandoned, I've been thrown off the horse, crow's going to get me, but the horse is making a path for future generations, and others will follow it. So it certainly owes a great deal to Mickiewicz. And in fact, there are a number of exiled Polish poets, Tadeusz Wada Zabłocki, who in his memoirs talks about Prince Baratov, and the Chapchavadzes, and he began learning Georgian. He started to translate Rustaveli. Because one of the great things about the Polish rebellion in 1830, the Poles were scattered all over Siberia and all over the Caucasus, and they did a great deal of good. They became botanists, they became railway engineers, to go from Batumi to Tbilisi. That railway was constructed by Polish engineers, particularly the Surami Tunnel. And in poetry, they had a great influence. And Georgians who were not allowed to go to Russian universities because of black marks against them, what the Russians call a wolf's ticket, the Volchyi bilet, they were allowed to go to Warsaw to study. And a surprising number of Georgian politicians and poets who studied at Warsaw Veterinary Institute to get their higher degree. Actually, one of these writers even became an inspector at the slaughterhouse as a result of his studies. But Polish and Georgian is a connection that we meet even in Baratashvili with this. Well, the riderless horse galloping out of control as a symbol of Russia, if you know the end of part one of Dead Souls. Where is this going? Georgians also felt that Russia was a horse out of control and a horse that was dragging Georgia along. Alexander Orbeliani, who was at the first a rebel against the Russian takeover, he complained, Russia is pursuing Europe on horseback and dragging us behind a rope and telling us don't lag behind. But we are running covered in blood and we think the Russians are doing us a favour. So that's a general idea of horse image. But I must say here, Baratashvili doesn't seem to have an overt political agenda. You can interpret this poem psychologically as the horse is some form of inspiration to make it easier for future generations to live in many ways. Now, the other thing about the poem, it has acquired a very wide interpretation in Georgia, and people are told that Merani is a folk word for horse, charger. And in fact, if you look at Georgian folk poetry, you don't read it. I think once or twice someone calls their horse Merani. It's not a Georgian folk word, it's not an Iranian word, it's not a mythological Pegasus. It is in fact one of the Mongolian words that have penetrated into Georgian, Mongolian Merani. In Russian, it's come out as Merin, which is a gelding, but in Georgian, it's come out as Merani, which is a charger, a steed. It first occurs in Rustaveli, which is a little puzzling because Rustaveli's time nobody knew about the Mongols. It may be a copyist's change. There it is. Merani is not what it seems. Now that poem about the, well let's call it Merani, it's known as that, the abandoned rider, was one of the first Georgian poems to be translated into Russian. It came out in 1889. In fact, rather good translated by an unknown translator called Tkharzhevsky. Летит мой конь вперед, дорог не разбирая, а горный ворон вслед зловещий крик свой шлет. Лети, мой конь, лети, усталости не зная, и по ветру разъей печальные думы гнет. My horse flies on, doesn't care what roads it's got. The mountain raven is sending its ominous shout after me. Fly on, my horse, fly, don't know tiredness, and scatter over the wind the oppression of sad thoughts. Well, that's pretty close, and it gallops along. It may be a bit cliche, but there it is. That was one of the first Baratashvilis ever to be known in Russian. Now, I'd like to end with what Baratashvili is perhaps the most romantic poem, which seems very Faustian. Evil spirit, who asks you to become my soul's confessor? This could be Faust talking to Mephistopheles. And the only problem, of course, is had Baratashvili read Goethe's Faust. Because Sulo Boroto Vingogich Moch Mogich Moch Chemet Sinat Khayra Chemis Gonivis Dasitsopich Shen Armash Potra Markvi Rauka Sad Armika Sulis Shvedova Listis Momikal Matsvins Brahma Sats Muneova. Evil spirit who asks you to become my soul's confessor, derange my life and agitate my mind. Say, where is my peace? Are you my mind's possessor? Why have you killed a faith so childlike and so blind? This is the first time a really dark side comes out in Baratashvili. And you can compare it with Goethe's Faust to Mephistopheles. Faust complains, so thou with thy cold devil's fist, still clenched in malice impotent. So the rather good English translation. Doth the creative power resist the active, the beneficent? Henceforth some other task essay of chaos thou, the wondrous sun. So rebuke to Mephistopheles. Well, he may not have known Goethe's, but he would have known Pushkin's Scene from Faust. Pushkin loved forging foreign poets. He invented them and then wrote pieces. And he invented a scene from Faust, which has had lots of people running through Goethe. Where is the scene? Where is the scene? In which Faust is getting more and more bored, and Mephistopheles thinks of more and more important things, and to give him finally a ship full of sailors, and Faust is drowned a lot. So he would have known a little bit of Faust from Pushkin. Well, we can conclude then that Baratashvili is extraordinary poet, extraordinary range, and he's a bridge between Europe and Georgia. You've got Rustaveli there, you've got Sayat Nova, you've got 13th century, you've got 18th century, and you have Europe in translation from 18th century, and he's a bridge to the 20th century, to Verlaine, to Tizian Tabis that continues it. One of the reasons I might say why he wouldn't have known Goethe's Faust was the decision by the Russian government when the school for the gentry, which he attended at Tbilisi, school for sons of the gentry, the command of corps decided there was no need to teach them German. I think it's a good idea. And the teacher of German was sacked and appointed inspector of orchards in Kakheti. We didn't know what happened to him afterwards, so there's no opportunity of learning German. French, however, was considered to be of great social importance, as many Russian aristocrats spoke it better than they spoke Russian, so they did learn French. Another fact about Baratashvili is versification. Problem with Georgian has been that, like all syllabic languages, you write poetry by counting the verses, the syllables, like French, Alexandre. They go for 8 or 16, occasionally 9, and the only variety you can do is where you put the break in the line. And Baratashvili is one of the first to really break that up and to have lines all different lengths. A great experiment. He's the first Georgian poet also to meet with a positive response in translation. So a bridge between archaic and modern vocabulary, is an experimenter with line, and for that reason, I think he remains, despite the fact that it's just this handful of poems, I'm sure one of the most important of all Georgian poets. With that, I'll stop. If there are any questions or remonstrations, I'll be happy to.
Thank you.